Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The Election Truth Alliance is a group I've been following for about a year, and the ETA has just done a report on Canada's most recent federal election, the 2025 federal election. And they've got some fascinating things to share with us. Ladies and gentlemen, my great honor to be speaking with. We've got Nathan from the Election Truth Alliance. We've got Pengi, and we've got Lily. Would you all be willing to just kind of provide a little brief introduction? Tell us about what you do at the Election Truth Alliance.
Yeah, I'll kick things off. So most people at this point are more familiar with me. Hopefully we'll change that in the near future. Executive Director of Public Engagement. I've at this point been pretty much the face of the ETA, mostly talking about some of our recent reports. I think I've had the honor of speaking with you before, Art. And you kind of doing some Q&A, so glad to have another opportunity. Most of my background is in cybersecurity, information systems, and a little bit of data analysis. So that's kind of where I helped start kicking off. Let's look at how our elections run. Let's look at the infrastructure behind those elections, and then working with Lily and Jive and Pengi, looking at the data.
Hi, I'm Pengi. I do work with the ETA, and I work on the data team, among a few other hats along the way. I've been with the ETA for a little over a year now. I've been digging in, finding all those juicy data elements to share with you all and highlight so we can keep things free, fair, and secure for everyone.
Hey, it's Lily here. I'm an executive director of communications and operations with the ETA. I've been doing this alongside Nathan from the get-go. My background is in political science and history, but another fact that is relevant to this conversation is that I, like art, am Canadian, so this is especially relevant to me.
Fascinating. It's amazing how many Canadians are really invested in this issue. We certainly feel like what happens in the United States is of great importance, great significance to the entire world, but especially Canada. So we're quite invested in this issue. So the Election Truth Alliance, if you've been following them, I don't know how they do it. They're working, around the clock, and they're constantly breaking out these new reports, these new, they'll do an analysis on a state or a county or a few counties in a state. And now the ETA has done a report on Canada, which, of course, Lily and I and all Canadians would be very interested in learning about. But it's a great kind of a comparison, a basis of comparison. And I understand that's why you did that. That's why you've done this report. Is that the case?
It definitely is one of the key interests. I would say that the work that we do and election forensics as a field is kind of inherently comparative. You're comparing elections in different places. You're looking at trends, what is considered to be normal or expected versus something that is not expected. And you're going to compare geographies. You're going to compare across different time periods as well. The US 2024 presidential election occurred, and then, within 6 months or so, we had the 2025 Canadian federal election. So these are pretty comparable, at least in terms of time and space. There are those different factors that you have to keep into account, the different systems, yes, but it is an interesting thing to look at them and see what trends may be shared or present in both versus what is different, what diverges between the two. One of the reasons that we wanted to look at Canadian data is because federally, not provincially necessarily, but federal elections in Canada, all votes are cast and counted by hand, all of them. And they are counted in the presence of witnesses, or as we would call them, scrutineers. So there's a fairly high standard of truth already just in how those processes are set up and the degree of scrutiny that is received. And so one of our key questions was, all right, well, what does this look like? What does the data look like in a jurisdiction where all of these votes are counted by hand? That's not the only difference, but it is a key one, and it's one we wanted to look into.
And on top of that, the direct comparison is, well, how does the US count our elections, right? How do we do it? We've been doing this, I think, at least 3 or 4 major elections, presidential at least, has been based upon these same voting systems. They do change a little bit from election to election, but as of right now, right, 24 election up to today, most people don't realize that across the US, we're using two major voting systems for at least 70% of the voting equipment. Might actually be higher now. And the concern is we're not counting our elections by hand. Canada is. And when we look at the data, we'll see the trends. But it's interesting because we've asked the question, if we're using these same systems across the US, and if every vote, almost every vote, I think it's around 99% or more of the votes cast in the 24 election were counted by a machine, even your hand-marked paper ballots, even your mail-in, then it really begs the question, if you could mess with those systems, could you create certain effects?
And I believe, based on the conversation we were having before this recording started, that Art, I think you have been, you have worked an election where you saw that process and what it was like, and maybe can you describe it for people who may not be familiar?
Yes. It was many, many years ago. It was when I was in university, and my girlfriend at the time, who always I had an eye out for great, like, new, interesting opportunities. And then, it was so simple. I just sat there in front of a box. I can't remember the exact instructions about fold your vote once and then fold it another. I don't know. But basically we'd tell people what to do, where to go mark their ballots, and then come around here and fold it and stick it in the box. And then at the end of the night, I counted the votes in front of, 3 or 4 different scrutineers, one for each party. And it was incredibly simple. I'll use this to demonstrate, but I'd get a ballot pull a ballot out of the box, and I'd open it up, and I'd just kind of go like this, and I'd say, it's one vote for the NDP or whatever. And everybody just had a clipboard in front of them, and they're just checking them off. And by it only took, maybe it was half an hour. I don't know, because I'm just counting one box of ballots. And there's a whole bunch of other people in this. It was a fire station, if I recall correctly, for that voting poll. And maybe took half an hour. We didn't have to do it twice. At the end of it, all of our numbers matched. We all agreed. We all shook hands, said goodnight, and we were out of there. Done. Simple. No concerns about any cheating or anything. And everybody around could understand what was happening.
So one of the differences is, as you mentioned, you're holding up the ballot. Everyone can kind of see it. You call it out. But you're only doing like one election, one race versus, I think that was the issue, is we have so many. I think some places have, 8 or 10 different local elections, state and federal elections on their ballot in the US.
Absolutely. That's a higher degree of complexity when you have multiple races on a ballot. And for those Americans watching who don't know this, you guys talk a lot about down ballot, right? Like, what's on my down ballot? Canada has no down ballot. We only have the top of the ticket. It is your local member of parliament, and that's it. So it is, it's simpler and more straightforward to hand count. But there is at least a shared recognition and examination of the ballots that occurs in some manner. People are looking at them, and you are not taking it on faith that the contents is a certain way.
And when it comes to the kind of phenomenon that the ETA really focuses on, and the phenomenon that I've learned about over the past year because of the work that you've done, the work of Shpilkin. Again, do I know the names? Is it Klimek, Shpilkin?
Yeah.
That phenomenon should, there's a way it should look, which is on the back of my T-shirt right now, and there's a way it shouldn't look, which is kind of on the front of my T-shirt. This kind of stuff. That shouldn't change. Like, is that true? Like, regardless of what kind, if you're having an election, if people are voting, there's a right way for that data to look, and there's a wrong way for it to look. Is that? I mean, is it basically?
And so when you start seeing these weird wonky lines, they kind of point to, hey, there's something that we need to investigate a little further here.
Well, based on these experts what should we expect at large scale voting behavior. And we have a little visual for it where you shouldn't see any consistent patterns or trends where higher turnout means one candidate is always getting higher average of votes. And that's pretty much what all these experts, Udot, Shpilkin, Klimek, are saying. So when we see an effect like this, where higher turnout begins to skew, that is a little bit of a red flag. And as you said, we've been covering and analyzing US elections because when we first started looking, we started finding those, what would be coined Russian tails in some of our voting behavior. And we asked the very simple question, well, what is another very popular, very prevalent election that's upcoming that we can look at and compare to how does the US do it? How does Canada do it? And I know, you and Lily were a little more close to how those elections are run. And it is a little different in the US. And I think there's a few key pieces that we'll talk about that are important for when we look at the data. So we do have graphics for you for Canada. We can probably touch base on just very briefly and show the things we're finding in the US compared to Canada and how interesting it is, how concerning it is, should I say. So we do have, very briefly, for those who aren't as familiar with our methodologies, there's 3 ways we normally look at election voting data in the US. Because most of the voting data we can get, the best quality is, it'll tell us at the precinct level how many votes were cast per candidate and how many voters were registered in that precinct. And that lets us do these turnout analysis, which are based on those experts we keep bringing up who have papers about Russian elections and other elections. We showed this before where if you're using a scatter plot, on the x-axis is the turnout, and each of these little dots, this is just one candidate. So normally we'll have both candidates, Republican, Democrat in the US, and we'll have them overlaid on one graph. Abnormal would be if we see precincts of higher turnout begin to favor one candidate. Now, what's important here is based on those experts we keep talking about, when looking at Russian elections, they were finding a symptom where places, and they use polling locations, of higher turnout began or always benefited one candidate over other candidates. And they raised the red flag that might be a symptom of stuffing ballots for one candidate. And it causes turnout to rise and it causes the amount of votes they're getting to rise. And if that's happening across a bunch of precincts, but only happening, in places of higher turnout, that could be an effective vote manipulation. And that's kind of what we're showing here is we're seeing the average vote share is going up or, is increasing, scaling with turnout, which we shouldn't expect to see this.
It's implying that those precincts that appear to have a higher turnout, maybe they didn't have a higher turnout. Maybe somebody just stuffed a bunch of ballots in there, and now it has the appearance of more people went out to vote there. Just for the odd listener who might be thinking, well, that's a good thing. If more people go out to vote, why would that be bad?
Yeah, and we always get a little bit of confusion because there's there's kind of this bias, or we're told that higher turnout is good for, in the US, it's good for like the Democrats, right? Higher turnout. Well, in this case, we're analyzing turnout per precinct. So we're not analyzing, how many, hundreds of thousands of people showed up across the county or the state, which can have an effect, right? More people voting will allow you to more accurately, decide how people feel about something. But in this case, we're looking at each precinct's turnout, which shouldn't correlate with any one candidate by default.
There should not be a correlation to the further right you get on a graph to only support one candidate when they weren't nearly that high at the beginning of the graph, right? Because the data array math doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Especially based on demographics, which we've highlighted a few times. We actually have a graph we'll show you very quickly at the end of this, where we're looking at some of the most blue counties in a state in the US, and it doesn't matter. It's the same effect. And that's really strange to see. How can some of the most left-leaning counties in Pennsylvania have the same effect as some smaller counties in other states? It begins to be a little too much, and it needs investigation, which is kind of where we're pushing for right now.
I just wanted to comment for as we go into the Canada charts for especially an American audience, but both for both audiences to remember that the colors are different in Canada for the different parties than they are in the United States. So remember that in Canada, red is Liberals, blue is Conservatives. We have more than one political party and more than two political parties. So we've got green for the Greens, orange for the NDP, and pale blue for the Bloc Québécois. So when you are looking and seeing those different dots of different colors, just a reminder to American audiences to not think, yes, blue, that's a Democrat. That must be the more liberal party. In the case of Canada, the red is liberal, the blue is conservative.
Yeah, we'll show another example of that. Okay, so very quickly, before we do the final comparison to Canada, just wanted to show an example of what we just described as being more normal when using these analysis based on U.S. This is Pennsylvania, one of the swing states in the U.S. Generally, we like to pull out Philadelphia, which we will have in a following graph. But we're looking at their mail-in, which is always interesting to look at. And we're not seeing any abnormal effects like we highlighted before, right? We see that precincts of low turnout on the left here. This is the scatter plot we talked about. Precincts of low turnout for both candidates versus precincts of high turnout. They're keeping around the same average vote share across all turnout, which is what you should expect to see. You shouldn't see any strong positive or negative relationship for any one candidate, in places of higher turnout. And on the right is just the same way of showing it, but instead of individual dots, we just group them. And in this case, we're grouping them by 10%. It takes down a little bit of the noise, a little bit of the clutter, and makes it easier to see that trend. So with that in mind, as Lily said, here is Canada on the left. And keep in mind the color scheme, right? So the largest or the party that seems to be getting on average the most votes is in fact the Liberal Party, which is red. We're not seeing any substantial change across all of these ridings. We see that ridings of 32% turnout versus ridings of 72% turnout on average. Both candidates are keeping around, or both parties, should I say, keeping around the same consistency. There's a little bit more chaos with the really small amount of votes for the third parties. Yeah. So overall, and we'll have a few other ways of showing this, probably a little more easy to visualize ways, but we're not seeing any strong relationship to turnout to one party. Both parties are somewhat consistent. There is a little bit of variation, but on average, we're seeing the Liberal Party is pretty consistent. Doesn't jump around too much. It keeps somewhere around, on average, 40, 45%, a little more, a little less, across all of these different ridings. Now, when we compare this to what we're seeing in the U.S. on the right, as you can see here, it really brings into question what is going on, because we're seeing almost a concern of you hit certain levels of turnout in these precincts and then things just shift, things switch. And so this effect is interesting because we asked the question, why does Canada look far more normal? Different country, different voting practices. And is this unique to the US? Maybe this is just something the US does. Well, in our analysis, every time we bring it up, we're looking at multiple counties and multiple states. And in future reports, we'll look at multiple elections across history. And it brings up the question of how could people vote in this way in lockstep? And how could these precincts all shift in this way across completely different demographics, counties, and states? Is there a bigger problem here that needs to be investigated?
Yeah, I'll add that at the time that we gathered our data from Elections Canada, only the riding level data was available. And so that's why we've called this our preliminary report, because ideally we'd love to come back and do more granular analysis. That would be fantastic. It is now available, is my understanding. So if folks who are super keen and want to do some granular analysis of Canada, please feel free, dive right in, get in touch. I will say, though, that, the 2025 election in Canada was our highest voter turnout as a country in 20 years. It was not a slump election. It was a very highly engaged election. And so the difference in turnout stands out to me too, Art, when I look at that and I try to envision what does an area look like that, where you're consistently seeing very, very high turnout above the 80 and 90% level. It's very unusual. for a variety of reasons. It's very unusual to see, and it is unusual to see one candidate or party benefiting disproportionately at just those high levels of turnout. That is a red flag.
And we have another visual actually showing, as I said, that the Russian elections, and in this case, this is 2012, their presidential election, compared to Canada, which I love this analysis. I think the first time we generated this analysis, Lily was like, oh my goodness, here it is. And so the way to read this analysis, it's the same thing based on turnout. On the left, we'll actually show you. So we have x-axis on the turnout. And instead of having individual dots, it's the kind of the same process of grouping them and scaling them on the y-axis. And the y-axis in this case is, I believe, the number of votes in those bins for these polling locations, or in the case of Canada, the ridings. So the effect we keep talking about, which is what is normal supposed to look like? Well, all candidates on average are going to have they're not going to see a huge separation. You would expect consistency for all candidates across all turnout thresholds, and they would almost mirror each other. And most of the time it would be this more of a mountain, a normal distribution shape. Not always, but interference such as, stuffing ballots or busing people to the polls in order to inflate turnout and inflate votes for one candidate. They're seeing and they're observing, right, that those polling locations of higher turnout, which is on the right side of this graph, the candidate, in this case Putin, begins to get more and more of those votes in only places of higher turnout. And that would be an effect mirrored by a vote manipulation stuffing. And that's what all these experts are talking about. And we're not seeing the same shift or trend to these other parties. So on the right, when we do that same analysis, this is, specifically the Shpilkin line chart analysis, we're not seeing any clear separation where one candidate begins to disproportionately grow in the amount of votes they're getting in any one place of higher turnout. So they're all almost pretty consistent. There's a little bit of variation for the smaller parties, but we're not seeing that kind of Russian tail, as you would say, that mirrors higher turnout. And then
I would add as well, just really quickly, Nathan, that, when we run this data, we don't know what we're going to see at the end. We don't know what story we're going to be told. We really do, let's see where the data leads. So when the Canada data we finally, we had to call on the phone with Elections Canada to confirm, are these the right turnout numbers? Can you confirm? Great. And when that went out for first analysis, I think we were all kind of waiting with bated breath, what's it going to look like? And finally, kind of getting that first look, it's almost like unwrapping a box and seeing what's inside. So we did not analyze the data at first, knowing it's going to make what we would expect to see, a bell curve. But that was what was there when it came back. And I know for me as a Canadian, that was a great comfort. That was an assurance for me that, well, this is what we would expect to see in a fair, unmanipulated election. This does not give me concern that the result of my country's election was different than the intention of the voters. And so that, just to say that you never know what it's going to look like, and it's you see where the data takes you.
And the best part is when we do this same analysis and directly compare it to some of the impactful counties in the U.S., like Pennsylvania, which was a key swing state, if you're familiar. There was a ridiculous amount of problems with their election on election day and leading up to and after the election in this state. So when we do the same analysis, we see a little bit of that shifting at higher turnout for one candidate, where they actually begin to overtake the leading party and leading candidate, but only in places of higher turnout. And this is, in the case on the right, this is Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, the most liberal Democratic county in the state, and with one of the most populated cities in the state. And so you're seeing the places where there were more votes cast, you're still seeing this effect, which is really interesting, because one of the processes we did do was starting to look at, where are these precincts? Do they match with any? That's the question we got, is well, maybe some of these higher turnout precincts are, in very, rural or right-leaning areas, and it could create this effect. But we're not seeing that consistency. We're seeing that it, independent of demographics, as soon as these precincts are hitting these higher levels of turnout, this effect is occurring. And it's not just happening here. It's happening across the state of Pennsylvania. It's happening across multiple swing states. And that is, as you would say, that is a red flag that needs to be investigated independent of, any partisan effects. It doesn't matter. This is basic election auditing, and we need to go look at those most anomalous precincts and do a second look.
I think one of the great challenges of U.S. election analysis is the number of counties and the diversity of systems for administering elections across all of those counties. It is staggering. It is more complex to even just get the data to analyze than people ever realize. We get volunteers that join the ETA and they are shocked at how difficult it can be to reconcile those numbers, to get that data, clean that data, and it's all done a little bit differently in all those counties. One thing that we do have going for us, and the reason that we could just be like, and we've got a preliminary report on Canada, bing, bang, boom, that's because there is one entity that administers elections federally in Canada. It is Elections Canada. They have been doing it since the 20s, I believe, early last century. And they are a nonpartisan organization, an independent organization, and they run every election in all of those 343 ridings. And so there is a degree of consistency of reporting that makes it infinitely easier. Well, considerably easier to pull that data and run and showcase it versus why it has taken us a long time to get as far as we have with as many states as we have, because they are all a little bit different, and that ends up making them hard to interrogate and hard to check and validate.
And the audit process in Canada is a little different, I imagine, as well, right? Since you hand counted that initial results, and then if there is discrepancies or if there is problems, what happens?
You count it again. If there's
you do it again, right? The same way.
You count it again. You count it again if there's a discrepancy. So Art, in the scenario that you were discussing, if there had been a discrepancy between the scrutineers that were there and yourselves, I don't have the protocols or the Election Act in front of me, but I would expect that based on my understanding, I worked as a provincial election support officer a number of years ago. And if it's anything like that, you would count them again. And you would count them again. And if you still couldn't agree, you might need to bring in other people to count them again. So maybe you would get a judge eventually, in some cases, to be witness to the counting of these ballots. But because ballots aren't counted by hand at all in many U.S. elections, it relies on this notion of audits, where you're going to go and maybe hand count or even just machine count again a certain percentage of the votes that were cast, as opposed to, in the Canadian context, you're counting everything by hand at least once, for sure.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting and kind of stood out to me as we were doing this report on Canada was the direct comparison of, as you said, right? When you audit, you just do the same thing again, and everyone watches harder this time if there's problems. And what's really frustrating is, as we've dug into the US, and Pingy will touch base on this, it is far more confusing, right? Every state can kind of do it differently if they want. It's based on their own local laws. Some places, we bring up the concerns of, as we said, if we're using the machines to count the votes originally, and we don't do an audit, or we don't do a larger audit, there's risk of never actually checking the original paper ballots. And then some of these audits are random, as we said. And
yeah, even to that point, as you said, we're using the machines to recheck the machines in many cases.
They'll run
they'll just run it through the same machine and see if they get different results, which is kind of wild. But then, digging even further into that, there's only 5 states that do a true risk limiting audit, which means, for those listeners, okay, so you have a fixed percentage audit, which means I'm going to do 2% of all of my votes and check them, right? And we're not even checking, did X person vote for Y candidate, right? We're saying we're going to run the machines and we're going to compare this to the subset of the vote tabulation we got earlier. Do they match? Cool. But a risk limiting audit goes a little bit step further, and they go, how close is the outcome of the 2 candidates of vote share? The closer they are to the center, say 49 to 50% or 51 to 48, or, the larger the percentage of ballots they will actually recount or recheck. either through the machine or in some cases, hand counts. There are some places that will require hand counts, but there's only 5 places in the United States that even go as far as doing a full risk limiting audit.
One of the major pushbacks we've gotten when working with U.S. elections is that concern of, well, every state runs their own election. They're accountable for their own election. So in order for you to influence an election, you would have to have people all over the U.S., right? You would have to, almost have compromised the election offices of every county and every state, or at least that's the response we get initially.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, as we talked about, when it comes to how the U.S. runs our elections, we're not hand counting. We don't have people sitting in every precinct of every county hand counting the results, equatable to like what you have in Canada. We have these major voting systems that use these optical scanners or touch screen, vote counting or vote casting computers. There's 3 or 4 major different configurations, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you cast that vote. It's still counted with these digital systems, and it's summed up at the county level. And the problem we've started finding is, as we've looked into these major brands and major systems, well, we asked the question, has there been any effort to mess with these systems at scale? Has there been any effort in the US in just the last couple of years to potentially compromise these major vendors, to compromise the operating systems of these scanners, maybe even to mess with the management system, which is what the counties use to collect and look at all their data? And we have found examples, even just going back to 2021, across 3 different major states so far that we know of, but I'm sure there may be others that aren't as popular. Looking at Michigan, Georgia, even in Colorado, where there were attempts, successful or not, to compromise these major brands and get access to the software, the systems, and the county election management systems as well. So it really brings up the question of, well, what would you need to mess with an election at scale, and what would be a symptom of it? And what are we finding, right? If you could mess with these systems at scale, if you could change votes or even cast votes for people who may not be voting, what would that effect look like? And then how does that comparing to the voting data that we are finding and we are analyzing, we are putting out there? And that is why we say we need additional investigations and we need audits, because the effects we are finding in the US for the 24 election mirror known examples of vote manipulation, as we're seeing in those Russian elections these experts have put papers out on. And we need to start taking the steps now to dive deeper into these systems we're using, figure out, are there vulnerabilities that can be fixed? Figure out, how we could look at our elections in better ways as we go forward, because we're going to use the same election systems and do the same audits in the midterms.
And in the spirit of interjurisdictional comparison, like we have here today with Canada and the US, I'll bring up a jurisdiction that considered moving to electronic systems for counting votes and decided against it, and that's Germany. So Germany, that decision went to, I believe, their Supreme Court. And it was the question of, is it within the German constitution to have machines be used to count votes? And it was decided that it wasn't. And what I really found interesting about that decision was the rationale. And the rationale was, how many votes a candidate gets has to be understandable to the average voter. It has to be readily understandable with no technical expertise or additional knowledge involved. And the rationale there was, because these systems are often black boxes, they often require, even if they weren't opaque, they require specialized expertise to understand what's working, what's happening there in the machine. And therefore, it couldn't meet that threshold of, it is readily understandable to everyone how we arrived at these numbers. And so it goes back, I think, in my mind, Art, to sitting around that table with the scrutineers, holding up the ballot and everyone looking at it and agreeing this is what it says on that. I think the average voter can understand that. But can the average voter, or most voters, understand the technical workings of a machine that is being used to count your votes? I would say no.
Yeah, I remember reading that myself, and you're absolutely right. I think they said something to the effect of, the elections are to be run by the people, for the people, and could the average citizen understand how this machine is working? No. So we We can't allow it. Yeah, another thing that reminds me of when I was researching this issue for a video is that you'll see a list of countries that don't allow votes to be cast by machine. They require paper ballots. And sure enough, the United States of America is one of those countries. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? And that's because, so with all these machines, I guess as long as they spit out a paper copy, or if you mark a paper ballot and then it goes into a machine, either way, as long as there's some paper trail, then that qualifies as we don't use voting machines.
Well, there's three major types of systems that are pretty common in the U.S. The most common, as you said, right, is hand-marked paper ballots. That is the most common type of voting. That's how many people in the swing states vote, is by hand-marked paper ballots. But you're still feeding those hand-marked paper ballots into an optical scanner. It's getting, recorded digitally, and then it's getting sent off digitally from the precinct to the county for like election day or even early voting. But the other two types that get a lot of attention right now, which are very small in the grand scale of U.S. elections, is those touch screens, right, where you're casting your vote digitally. It'll have a little receipt, but your vote is never scanned. It's cast digitally. And then the other most common type is going to be the ballot marked or machine marked paper ballots, which you just use a machine to make that original ballot, print it out, scan it in an optical scanner. But we don't hand count in our elections. That's not our first response. I think at this point we found in 4 or 5 different states, they had a handful of precincts that were small enough to hand count, but nearly 100% of the votes in the U.S. election for the 24 election at scale were all machine counted, whether they were mail in, got sent in and still scanned optically, whether they were cast in person. They're all still used and counted by these digital voting systems, these major brands that we keep talking about.
And here's the final rant I'll make. The United States, at least, on whatever resource I was reading about, they were trying to lay claim to this idea that, no, we just use paper ballots. No, we don't. We'll use machines, but there has to be a paper ballot backup. We have to have the paper ballot backup. But try to do an audit of those paper ballot backups. I mean, there's so much faith put in the U.S. election system because there's these paper ballot backups. Well,
and yet we can't
count them every now and then.
I was going to say, if we don't actually full on count them, are they really doing us a great service?
Yeah. Why do we retain them by federal law for 22 months? And yet
we're not willing.
We're not able to go in and actually do an inspection in many of these states that, there are concerns. It's like, what is the point in keeping a record if no one can ever actually, review that record?
Because I know some counties, to be able to go in and look at the ballots and inspect them and do like a recount, they charge a fairly large fee, right?
Many counties will charge you based on, in states that legally you are allowed to inspect the physical records. Most of the time they will charge you based on their estimates for how long it would take their personnel to prepare those records. Many of the time, I know, for example, Florida had a few counties where we asked, hey, can we have images made? And they would cite you $16,000 to get those images made, which, they should already have digital copies. So it is one of those things where in the places you can check, you have to fight that fight of, well, it would cost us time and money to allow you to inspect these things.
Yeah, I would just say as well, if you take a paper copy, but you never look at it again, what's the utility there? The utility is a theoretical, but you're not allowing people to actually do it. And it's not part of your regular process.
The main concern as well is the longer you go from when those original records were made to when you inspect them, the more time there is for shenanigans, as we would say. So it's almost, I'm not saying that there are people out there who, could, want to mess with certain things or seize, original records, but it's kind of one of those things where the chain of custody is very important. And in the US, we entrust the chain of custody to the county. And it's kind of one of those things where we should be incentivized to investigate problems as soon as possible. At the end of the day, if we're getting told our elections are free, fair, safe, and secure, we should be able to verify that.
I genuinely believe, Art, I genuinely believe that a lot of the people that at least we talk to who run these elections, they believe with all their hearts that this is free, fair, secure, and that this is an unnecessary integrity check, that they, like, we did everything right, why would we need to? And oftentimes we hear wild assumptions that people state as fact. But our machines aren't connected to the internet. Nothing could have happened. Well, you're using modems in all of your machines. They certainly can, and or a USB stick gets around that. We hear there's an assumption of integrity and this faith in systems that can be very damaging, even when it comes from a place of protection. Because if the system is not helping you, but you have utter faith that it always will, then it really leaves it open to harm, and for profound harm to happen to the people who rely on that system.
What we like to say in the cybersecurity world is there's two types of companies. There's the company that knows it's been hacked and the company that doesn't.
I feel there's this fear of creating doubt, causing the public to question the integrity of elections. But if you take that same approach to anything else, imagine your family SUV that you're putting your kids in every day, and somebody suggests, maybe you should check your brakes. Who's gonna say, "Oh no, I don't want to create any panic in the family that maybe our brakes aren't,
Trust me, bro, your brakes are
reliable." Yeah, I think, the more important thing is that we just make people feel confident in the brakes so we won't check them.
It's right. Security theater. It's kind of like, hey, don't look behind the curtain, don't look over here. And what's frustrating is a lot of the pushback recently we've gotten when it comes to using these systems is the convenience, is the speed, is the time of saying, oh, if we use these machines to count our votes, they are far more accurate and they are far faster. So we can get our results faster and better and, on election night or right after. But the problem is we're not thinking of things from a perspective of, if there are bad actors out there, could they mess with these systems? Could they compromise them? And that is a weakness. And I think that's the problem, is we're using these systems and trusting that no one would ever want to mess with them, but then we're not taking the steps to actually make sure no one is messing with them. And we know at this point, as we talked about, we know there's been entities, both foreign and domestic, that have attempted to and successfully compromised some of these systems we're using.
Yeah.
I think as well, on that note of systems, what I've seen is that even people who have lost faith in other systems in the US, Americans who are looking at other parts of their government and are saying, this is clearly broken, it is another threshold to cross to open up the possibility and grapple with the possibility that extends to election systems. I think there is really a visceral fear of what that could mean. And as you said, Art, it's almost like the more important thing is not opening up that section of doubt versus, well, no, the more important thing is making sure your election results are safe, secure, valid, and verified. Because in the long term, the governments are not, you don't have to motivate a government to do anything that it says it's going to do if they have a reasonable belief that they can make sure that they can stay in power forever or get in power for all time. That is the consequence of that is the only consequence really for elected officials, is to not be elected again. And so it ends up being the mechanism through which you can ensure accountability. And if that is broken, then you need to go and find the break. You need to go fix the break. And you can't just say, I don't want to look at the breaks. You've got to go do it. It's very, very important. And otherwise you are sticking your head in the sand and you are championing a concept of stability over what you actually need to do to achieve it.
Yeah, if you can't vote someone out of office, what good is having elections in the first place?
And I believe in some places early primaries have already started.
I think I saw that. I saw.
Like in Texas, I think primaries are going on right now.
Oh my God! As a Canadian, our election was like 30 days. It's so it just goes for so long for you guys. How do you stand it?
It's all different cycles.
All different cycles.
Like our Canadian parents will yell at hockey. The parents yell this. Either skate or get off the ice. You know, the parents yell that at their kids. And it's kind of what you're saying, you know, either do it right or let us do it right. But the fact of the matter is there's no getting around, at least the perception that these folks, they are feeling quite insecure about what they would find. Because if they weren't, they'd do it. You know, it's pretty simple. If you do something good in life, you want to prove it. And if you do something bad, you want to hide it.
A lot of the time we get told our hands are tied. You know, that's a very common response we get is they're like, well, based on election law, we aren't allowed to do anything else unless there's an official investigation and concerns. And we're like, well, what would it take to compel an official investigation? You know, what type of evidence would we need to collect? And we've been collecting evidence. So it's kind of frustrating to get those responses. I will say, you know, today, up to date, you know, I think more people are becoming aware of the problems. You know, our work is becoming more important because the data shows a concern, but then as more people learn about the things we talk about when it comes to the voting infrastructure, and certain statements in the news, more people are starting to kind of watch. And as you said, the midterms is going to be an opportunity to do the same type of work, to do the same type of analysis, and react on is there problems and actually catch it and stop it from happening in the first place.
Well, Art, thank you so much for being here and facilitating this conversation. It's been fantastic to have you as a guest interviewer for us. And to everyone who's watching, a lot of what happens next is down to you and down to, you know, engaging in your communities, amplifying our message and the message of others. Like, subscribe, comment, help the algorithm out, get the word out there. We really appreciate it. And we will look forward to chatting with you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.